The Museum of Contemporary Art Denver presents Practicing Citizenship, a conversation series featuring artists, activists, and experts exploring civic engagement. Tonight, we bring you Paul Ramirez Jonas and Kendal Henry on public art. And now, here's Sarah Bai, MCA Denver's Director of Programming.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Bai. I am the Director of Programming at MCA Denver, and this is Practicing Citizenship, a program series MCA Denver is producing in conjunction with the exhibition Citizenship, a Practice of Society. We're coming to you live every Wednesday night throughout the run of the exhibition. And tonight we are presenting a conversation about public art with Paul Ramirez Jonas and Kendal Henry. Paul's most recent large public work, titled Public Trust, asks participants to examine the value of their word. People declare a promise, which is then recorded into a drawing. It's both whimsical and sincere, and the promises stay on display as public monuments. Tonight, he and Kendal will talk about this work in specific, Paul's work more broadly, and public art in general. We are thrilled that we are able to present this amazing programming during the pandemic. We're thrilled that you are joining us, but it takes a lot to put this all together. If you have the means, please consider donating to support MCA Denver. We suggest a donation of $10, which is what we would normally charge for tickets, but of course, any amount helps. We thank you so much for your support. Before I introduce Paul and Kendal, we'll show a quick 6-minute video tonight about public trust, and immediately following that, we'll jump into Paul and Kendal's conversation. I'll introduce Paul and Kendal, and we'll go right into the video. Paul Ramirez Jonas' work challenges the relationship between artist, viewer, and artwork. His work has been exhibited all around the world. In 2016, his Public Trust project was presented by Now and There in Boston, and it has been presented since at MoCA Cleveland, the Contemporary Art Museum Houston, and it's currently on view at MCA Denver. Kendal Henry is an artist and curator who lives in New York City and specializes in the field of public art. He illustrates that public art can be used as a tool for social engagement, for civic pride, and economic development through the projects and programs he's initiated around the world. He is currently the director of the NYC Department of Cultural Affairs Percent for the Art Program. And now, the video.
Well, this is the promise table, and with here you can make a promise.
Please take a seat. Are you making a promise together, or are you making a promise alone?
Well, we ask people to make a promise, and then we put them along with other promises that we hear daily on the news.
So things countries, politicians, weather people have all said that they're going to do.
And then we put it up on the board
for everyone to see. Sunsets at 7:01 today.
India pledges to join climate deal.
Chelsea Clinton vows to stay friends with Ivanka Trump.
And here's a space for your promise.
So have you thought of your promise?
Oh, okay, wait a minute, let me think about this.
I don't think I make many promises.
Sometimes we promise things and our situation changes.
I don't think people have made many promises to me, nor would I ask them to make promises to me.
I'm more concerned about if I don't achieve what I put out there, I'll be disappointed in myself. I'm very non-committal, but if I do,
I take it pretty seriously,
follow
through with, especially in the public realm.
We have a promise!
It's funny because there's a lot of things I don't understand about public interaction, and there's some things I understand really well. And then there's something where I always feel naive, but it's always turned out true, is that I really trust people. If you trust people, if I'm doing a gesture of trusting you, really, not like a simulation of trust or a condescending trust, like really, I trust you, then I feel like people always meet you halfway.
Making a promise public has many steps, right?
A promise is a way for us to have like a little like contract together.
So that's why we're going to put it down on paper now. It's both a contract and a drawing simultaneously. It also has our seal. And now all this needs to be complete is your signature. Now you have a choice.
You can either give us your signature, your fingerprint, or your blood. Which would you like?
And put the blood anywhere you want. We have a promise.
If you really believe in everyone's an artist, you got to make space for that. As much as a control freak as I can be about like the font size and the table and all of these objects, then what happens in the space that's literally being framed for the participant, I can't control that, right? But I'm trying to create a really strict framework for you to say something. So it's like I'm not delivering content as much as like trying to make space for the viewer's content.
We have a promise.
In order for your promise to become real, you have the option to make an oath or a vow.
We have the U.S. Constitution, the Jupiter Stone.
Swear to God.
Okay, so when you shake my hand, you say the promise out loud.
I promise to forgive my flaws.
I suppose enjoy your life seems like a better.
I would promise to expand people's horizons. I promise to be a bridge that connects people to their destiny. I didn't realize that you take an oath and
Put your name on it,
and they give you a
everything,
copy of it.
If I frame it or something, I'll see it all the time.
So now you're gonna see your words, and I plan to frame it and carry it with
That's
me.
why I like it. Yes, because it will hold me accountable. Exactly.
I think I'm going to keep this someplace I can see it often.
I have a lot of hope for those drawings sitting in people's homes for years and years and years. And that is also a public I'm interested in. Like the friend that comes to dinner is like, what's that? Oh, blah, blah, blah. And then the story morphs and deforms and lives on.
The other promises on the board, I don't know, they don't matter to me.
Nobody means what they say, and it's all empty promises to me now.
It's sort of like the word love these days. Everyone uses the word love so casually. I think that we are challenged in our generation and at this time in life where people are saying all kind of things, especially if you consider, this is the political time.
There's something I don't understand, which is that at the human level, we trust each other and we believe everyone is wonderful and everyone's a good person. But then as we scale it up, you can see there's a complete breakdown of trust. With this piece and hopefully with other pieces, I want to understand that. I actually don't have the answer, but it is the question I'm trying to figure out. Why is it that these contracts degrade as we scale them up?
Good evening,
Hi, Kendal.
everyone. Hey, Paul. I
Hi, everyone.
just want to thank Sarah and MCA Denver for inviting us to this conversation. I always welcome any opportunity to talk to you, Paul. I like having a little
Same
chat.
here.
And so this is, this is fantastic. Before we start, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. When I was watching the video, I was thinking well, here we are 4 years later.
But this could have been made yesterday, right?
Well, yes. And when I was making it, I read this book called The Sacrament of Language, an archaeology of the oath. And it's this Italian Agamben who really thinks that our Western politics are based on the oath. And so he did this research about where does the oath come from? And then he finds how language, politics, and religion are all interconnected by this. And there's a part in that book that when I read it was like, yeah, that's very speculative. But he was saying that when we start to not believe that language can hold a promise, then our civilization will fall apart. And I was like, yeah. And then last week, happened.
There you go. Came to pass. Came to
Yeah.
pass. So I was always interested. I love your work and I follow your work all the time. And I was always interested to find out, like, what happens in your head when you kind of come up with a project. Like, for example, with Public Trust, what was besides the book you just mentioned, was that it, or was it what's happening in the world at the time in 2016? What was that process that made you come up with this work? And not just conceptually, but then all the practical aspects of it, swearing on the different forms of, really, whatever. So what was all that? If you could share that with us.
Well, I work really slow and I work in this iterative way, right? So projects usually start very small and then they keep growing, they keep repeated, and they change title and they become more complex. So before Public Trust, there was for example, a project where I was I got my license as a notary public, and it was all about lying. That you would tell me a lie, and I would write it down and notarize it, and I would say, well, now this is a legal document. I've turned it into a truth. And at the time, I kept thinking, well, what is a lie, right? And then then if people, so I was already thinking about these things we can do with our mouths, right? Like lie, place bets. So there's that aspect of the work. And then I'm really interested in, well, what is public and what is art, right? And how do you create participation? So I'm always looking at things like spare change, or, so I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it developed really slowly out of the lie piece, which I thought had really no consequence at the time. That was too playful and it didn't make people think. I thought, well, let's make a promise work about promises, because promises are potential lies. Right? So then it just starts to build really slowly, like I played like play act with my assistant in my studio, and we're like, hey, we're going to make a piece about promises, and say like, hey, Nate, I promise I'll buy you a drink after work today. And then he'll say, okay. But then he'll say like, well, how do I know you're going to come through with it? And so there was a Bible in this. It's like, I'll swear on the Bible. And then we're like, well, we could swear on any sacred text. So then we go on Amazon and we order more sacred texts. And then it just starts to morph from there. And then we try it with real people, and then more things happen, and we keep adapting.
So did it evolve to what it is now from what it was in 2016 at all, or it pretty much stayed the same?
No, once what we did is we, John Spiak, so he runs a fantastic place called Grand Central in Santa Ana, and it's part of the Fullerton. Well, I think he's in the audience. He's just I'm butchering the name and the location, but he runs these great residencies, and he's a great supporter of the artists in general, and very agile. And I think we were talking about, I was developing this project. It's like, well, come try it here. And he has like a first night. They do a first night in downtown Santa Ana for all the art spaces open at once. And demographically, Santa Ana is very similar to New York City or all our big cities, in that it's incredibly diverse, lots of immigration, lots of different cultures, and that's kind of the public I want to address. So I really wanted to try it to see how it worked. So we did it 3 consecutive first nights, and that's when it evolved. So like the first time we did it, I was sort of improvising, and we recorded it. And then from that, we made a script, and we changed things, simple things like, oh, my hands can't reach this thing on the table, or this was not used, we need something else. And because it's like a little machine. And then the second time we showed the revision, but this time I followed a score I wrote, and we hired a young actor to watch me while he read the score to see if the score really captured it. And the third time we did it a month later, the young actor did it, and I watched. And each time we adjusted it. So by the time it got to Boston, it was like, this is the shape. It had a training video, it had a score, and all the parts were screwed down to the table.
See there, folks, you experienced the work and you have no idea how much work went into it before you saw it. So this is pretty cool to hear you sort of state how it evolved and how it, before you brought it out, how what you had to go through. In terms of the audience now, so you showed it outdoors where there's a general public to interact with it, and you showed it in a sort of a museum or a gallery space where people tend to come to see art in a particular way. And so has the audience reaction been different, or has the interpretation of what's happening been different in your experience?
I don't know, because I haven't experienced it. So I haven't experienced it in Denver, for example. But I did experience. So it's tricky, right? Because there's the ideal situation, and then there's where you can show things and who can support a project like that. So so even in Boston, even though it showed, let's say in the field, right? Not every place is different. It's conditional, in public space is public, but not to everyone, right? Like if I'm in a bucolic college and I look like a student, I can walk right into a library, sit on the floor and have my lunch with a book open and no one says anything. If I look like a homeless person, I walk into a library, I get kicked out, right? So your body and what you look like really determines. That's why I'm always like, who is the public? So even in Boston, because of its intense history of segregation, we really were like, but it can't just be shown in public. We need 3 different spaces that can try to. It's always impossible to address everyone, but to at least attempt to address the different kinds of publics of Boston. So yes, the piece is made by the public, so it changes every time. So I can tell you that I also showed it in Mexico, for example, and everyone. I don't know. I'm very confused and moved by that. On the one hand, I'm like, everyone's the same, and then at the same time, it's like, no, everyone's extremely unique. I know that each location has a different character. I have a different piece where people just pin things to a sculpture, and once I showed it at an art fair, and I realized it cannot survive this context. Right? It can. Nothing interesting comes out of this. So I don't know if that answers your question. What I can say is, the more heterogeneous the public is, the better.
Yeah, you did answer my question, and I do a lot of public art commissioning, and I'm always interested in that public interaction, and particularly from the artist perspective, because we charge the artists to do a lot of that work in terms of engaging the public to a certain extent. But in something that you said in the video we just saw, you said, there's a lot of things that I don't understand about public interaction, and there's a lot of things you understand really well. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Oh, the things I understand really well are weirdly formal. Like I go and I look at Chipotle and go to the Apple store, and I understand that for people to engage, you need to treat them with respect, and I think of that as service. And that paradoxically, that if it's done well, it's invisible. But if you treat someone with disrespect, it's extremely visible. Like you go to a bad DMV, for example, and you can feel how oppressed, like they don't want you. I don't know. It's the way the chairs look, they're not comfortable. The walls have not been painted. But if it's a good experience and you feel welcome, it becomes almost invisible, right? So that I understand, that I need to take great care in all the little details, even if it's an 8-minute interaction with someone who's not an art viewer and might never look at art again. I need to treat them like it's like a 7-course meal with all the trimmings, right? So I understand that, but then I understand really perverse things, like if you put a mic up, right? And you say, everyone can go out to that mic and say whatever they want. No one will. But if you put a karaoke machine and you can say, we only have 50 songs, people go, right? So is that too much? Too open doesn't work, right? So I understand that I have to create something that's very restricted to get you in, but then has to open up. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does.
Like I give the example of like, you see a chained pen and you're like, oh, I'm supposed to use it. And I'm like, that's it, right? Like but the chained pen is also telling you, I don't trust you. You might steal this pen. So there is something very perverse about public engagement because it's manipulative ultimately, right? The invitation has to come in this very specific cultural way so it can be understood.
So earlier when you were describing the process you went through to realize public trust, I didn't hear, not that I needed to hear it, but I didn't hear if there were, besides people in your studio and people that you interacted with, how the public was involved in the realization of the work. You know, like, so you make work where it's not finished until the public interacts with it. So you create the infrastructure and then you put it out there and the public interacts with it and it's a finished work, which I think it's an amazing kind of way to work. And I wish I had opportunity to work that way with artists on the most part. But is there, when we say public art, and that word is always looking at that word public is always sort of in part of that, do you see a sort of bunch of separate ways to incorporating the public in the process, or the public needs to come in at a particular point throughout the process, or what is your thought in that?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a lot of public art that instrumentalizes the public, right? And English is not my first language, so I just play sometimes with words because it helps me. Because it's not my first language, I can sort of be like, oh, that's weird, you know. So I go like, with the public, for the public, you know, through the public, you know, and each one almost creates an image of a different kind of sculpture or situation. So, wait, what was your question?
So how do you think about the public as you make the work, or is there, where do they come in your process? Is it always at the end when you kind of formulate a structure and then say, well, the public finishes the work because they interact with it? Or as you're working with it, you kind of, there's opportunities for the public or to come in and say, well, you know, why don't you do this way, and it changes or evolves. So what goes on in your head there? How do you feel it's the most appropriate way?
There's a funny thing that happens. I think that maybe it's the training of artists. Like I was trained as an artist, that you try to complete the work. And then there's always this moment where I can't figure out how to complete it. And then I'm like, wait. No, wait, what have I learned over the last few years? But it happens every time. It's almost like I can't learn the lesson. I get stuck that I can't finish it. And it's like, wait, I don't have to finish it. And I just kind of take myself out. And once I take myself out, I sort of see the empty space, kind of almost literally, very visually, I see the empty space. And then I'm like, oh, now I just need to make this empty space kind of inviting. Right, like, and that happens over and over. And I keep thinking, once you get stuck in that problem that you can't solve it, the problem is you. Like you need to take yourself out, right?
That's an interesting way of putting it. Yeah.
But you can't always achieve it, right? It's like there's different amounts that the public can finish the work. One thing that during public trust, something happened that I thought, I want to make a work that can account for this, is that someone participated and said, this looks really interesting. Can I be one of the promise takers? And I thought, that's the ultimate future of that kind of openness, right? Where there's the role of facilitator and there's the role of participant and there's the role of creator, and they start to actually be mutable. There's a really beautiful piece by Aida Sejovic, who is of Bosnian descent, and she makes this piece about the genocide that happened in Bosnia, and she tries to brew as many cups of Bosnian coffee as there were people killed in Srebrenica on this particular day that there was a massacre. And it's an insane number, thousands and thousands of cups of coffee. And the piece begins with her and a very small crew of people brewing the coffee in a public space. And people start to ask the question, and eventually, and they explain, oh, we're trying to do this thing, we'll try to do it by today. And then people, a percentage of people always go like, well, you're not going to be able to finish. So they start to help. And then the next person comes along. It's really beautiful to watch. Then eventually someone else comes and speaks to someone who just joined the piece, but they think it's a performer, right? And you see that what you think are the people who are making the piece are just members of the public who are drifting in and out. until the piece is complete.
Mhm.
And I really admired that work, because I was like, how do you make a work like that where even the facilitators are actually the public itself?
Mhm. And that example that you gave is sort of what I have noticed, that anyone who is looking to commission an artist to do a public art and wants to get the community or the public involved, that's the model that they usually go for. The idea that the public, the community, is just physically making the work with the artist, right? Or physically interacting with the artist in a way that creates the work. What is your thought on that? And it's just the one way. It's always like, you have a conversation. Oh, where does the community come into this, and how do they work with this to make the work? And it doesn't always work well, because it becomes a design by committees thing sometimes. So how do we counter that? And I'm sort of looking for advice here, kind of, because so what are your thoughts on that? Help here.
No, that's really tricky, and because I feel like everyone who works in the public realm ends up. That's why I love the public realm. It's like, it's so complicated and there's nothing pure about it. Like, how can you make pure art in the public realm, right? It's so full of life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And anything from like, your sculpture can't be that big because a fire truck needs to go through here, and to like, I hate that your piece is casting shadow on my community garden. It's like everything comes in. So when you say you need help, I need help too. And one thing that I started to do was read a lot of theory, I guess, about what constitutes a public.
Mm-hmm.
And when you start to read that, you realize that very few things are apublic, right? Because it's a very fluid thing, chicken and egg, right? It's like, someone stands up and gives a speech, and then the people congregate. That's a public, but is the speech made by the public or the public making the speech? But everyone in a committee is not a public, strictly speaking, because it's a very organized thing made by committee and selection, and it's rigid. So what I've learned is, like, a lot of things that are problematic, let's say, in our field, is because they're not truly public situations. And so what helps me is to see, like, this is actually not a public situation. It's a lot of people working together, but it's not a public situation.
So how do we begin to define what that is in any given project? How do we, like, say, well, how do we suss this out? If you have a whole bunch of, any given project, you have a whole bunch of people who think that because they're maybe live or geographically are associated with the location where this artwork is going to go, so it's theirs. But let's say the subject matter may be, touching on a larger scale of people, so it's theirs, and so the people who are with the money to do it is theirs, and then the artist, it's his or hers. And so how do you think is a good? And I'm asking you because you're, like, in my head, you're one of these artists who sort of maneuver through the minutia of public very well, So I'm just wondering, what do you think about when these things come up?
Well, what I always think is that it's funny. I guess I do have a kind of method, let's say, the Paul Ramirez method. I always feel that everyone needs to have a stake on it, right? And quite literally, in a very transactional way, everyone needs to get something out of it, and everyone needs to think that it's for them. So it has to be like a weird diamond, right? Like every side of the prism, but then it's also very important to include yourself as an artist. That there's also something in it for you. Otherwise, it's just some exhausting thing that you just did a bunch of stuff for a bunch of other people, right? And it's but it's difficult. I know what you're asking. It is difficult, but I'm trying to say it has to be baked a little bit into the structure, right? That it can be something for everybody else. And in a way, I think the scariest part about that, and that's why sometimes it's hard even to fund my work, is like, it has to be strangely contentless, right? But it can be insipid at the same time. You know, like, what is this about? It's like, well, it's about what other people are going to make it about. And I'm scared of that sometimes, because I'm like, well, we've certainly seen in the last 4 years how things can be taken over, you know, and well, what happens if the wrong kind of speech happens, you know? I certainly believe people should go into public space and demonstrate for whatever reason. But then I don't think they should like break into Congress and try to like, hang the vice president. So, but it's such a fine line. It's like, you make something empty, you make an empty form, you want people to fill it with their own meaning. Then you have to be ready to accept meaning that is distasteful to you. And we used to be able to respect norms, right? But now we're in an era where people are breaking unspoken agreements that are not written into law. They're just agreements we had as human beings. And I don't know. I fear that the kind of work you are trying to make and I'm trying to make might become increasingly more difficult.
Yeah, and I know you bring up these questions so we could have these conversations, because I find myself talking to myself about them half the time, and it's sort of like there is no answer per se, but I think there is ways of experimenting to figure out what an answer might be, and any given situation might have different answers. So because I think a lot of it too is there's been quite a need for the public, the community, however you want to label it, to see themselves represented in the public environment, right? And so that's having a voice in the creation of something, whether it be with an artist or on their own or whatever, is been on the forefront of everything that's happening these days, particularly with the removal or the keeping or the conversations around monuments. It's this representation. How do we figure out how do we deal with the lack of or the overrepresentation of certain individuals or in the society. So yeah, I think it's a lot to do with representation to a certain extent and having a voice.
Yeah, and I think also part of the problem is that I talk about this endlessly. I always feel like we have about 12 monumental forms in the culture, right? And to me, it's like, well, that's just not enough. Like, come on, we have to do better, right? Like, we have the triumphal arch, we have the obelisk, we have the fountain, we have the bust, we have the full figure, we have the wall with names of the dead. We have, like, right, you start to run out of forms really quickly. And then I was like, part of the problem is maybe these forms have too much baggage and they're exhausted. Maybe we're asking too much of them, right? Versus, why can't we? So one thing I have in my studio is a list of every compound word with the word public in it, right? So it says public school, public bathroom, public radio, public enemy number one, just like, just like 50 of them. And I'm like, well, any of those could be a good monument. So I think that one way around the problem is also if we're going to say we're going to make a statue of a man on a horse in this community, it's going to be a bleep show, right?
Yes, exactly.
Who's the man? What kind of horse? But if you say we are going to make a monument in this neighborhood that is a public radio station, suddenly there is, my idealism is like, then suddenly there's some openness from everyone to reimagine what that can be.
But I also think that the problem there too is that I've noticed is that what the general public understands to be a good monument or to represent a monument are those men on horses and those people on the pedestal. So if you say let's do a public radio and call it something, then it becomes, well, I don't see my representation in the other figures, the other forms of monuments, and so it doesn't count.
Yes, and I was in a panel discussion with Xavier Simmons, and I was arguing that nothing should be permanent, nothing should be figurative, And she pointed out, it's like, but then that means that the only thing left that is representational does not represent the majority of Americans, or 50% of Americans. Well, no, the majority of Americans is mostly, if you just say it's mostly white men, so you don't have any women, people of color, yeah, it's so it's like the built environment doesn't reflect you. And when she said that, I was like, oh, I'm wrong. As much as I hate like super traditional sculptures, the record has to be rebalanced, right? Unfortunately, we're always in a position of scarcity. It's not like there's this abundance of funds for public art, right? So we can be like, we'll have some traditional sculptures and we'll have some weird public radio sculpture. We're always saying we only have enough money for one thing to put in a place that already is lacking things. So it's hard to expect the community to be generous, right, in what they think art is, because they're only getting one.
They're only getting the one, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for those of us who know better, a bronze sculpture of someone is just so limiting. It's not, if you sort of compare a bronze sculpture versus your public radio, I think the public radio will give much more to the community, much more to a group of people than a static bronze sculpture. But to sell that idea to a non-art public is very difficult.
Well, for myself, what I do, that's why I do iterations. It's like a shell game, or sometimes I feel like I'm the traveling con man. I'm like, can I give a key away, the key to the front door of the museum away? And people go like, no. And then I find someone. For example, I have a sculpture that's like, I want something from the collection, a face or hands, on a photocopy machine. So any member of the public can press the button, photocopy it, and then they have a photocopy of the sculpture. So I asked MoMA, and they're like, no. But then I convinced, the Portland Art Museum in Oregon to do it for an hour. But then I had documentation, and I could say, well, this museum did it. I don't say for an hour, because they had to have it for an hour with 2 guards looking at the public do it, And then in Houston, we were able to do it for a whole show, right? So I also find that, artists have to be more patient. Like if you're going to try to really change attitudes, you really have to have the temperament to work with people and be patient, and change doesn't come all at once, and change doesn't come at all by well, that's actually my temperament. I always think like change doesn't come by imposition or by a huge demand, right? I think like you can just work with people and get them into it slowly.
So you make it sound like which it is. I'm not sort of calling you anything, but that public art is quite difficult to do, and to a certain extent.
Yes, it is.
Okay,
I do know that it's super hard to do.
That's why I say that in the beginning. I'm not calling you on anything that I don't know for myself.
But the rewards are amazing, right? Because when you make something for the gallery, for example, it's always like your friends go like, who's gone to your show? And you can say 50 people. That's not what they mean. They're like, who important came to the show? And it's like, how's your show doing? Did you sell something? You have a review. But when you make public art and the public receives it, you don't need a review. You don't need to sell anything. You don't need to people even know that you made it, right? Just the fact that it exists, that actually was able to manifest itself in the world. That's the success, right? It's not like you make it and then you're waiting for some success that depends on, I don't know what, some power structure.
Let's talk about that success word you just said there. So what constitutes a successful work of art for you? What is that? What does that look like?
In the public or in the gallery?
Public first, because the gallery is easy to determine what a successful piece there is.
That's true. We have metrics, right?
Yeah.
I think you just, it's like, you know it when you see it, right? It's like, because for me, it's super easy because the work is participatory. It's like, are people participating? Yes. if they're not participating, I can't tell myself a pretty story of like, in the future, people will participate. It's too advanced. No, it's like, I failed, right? It's super brutal. But if people are engaged, and for me, there's some metrics. One is they're engaged, they don't care that it's art, and they don't care who made it. And I've started to suspect that people perceiving it as art or perceiving it by authored by someone actually gets in the way of them participating, which is right, because then where's the space for them?
There may be an intimidation factor that's saying that it's art, and we have that connotation of what art is. So
then you got to do it right.
Yeah. I remember when I first used to commission public art back in the day, and we put the work up. It's successful if the work wasn't tagged or graffitied or destroyed by the next day. That was constituted a bit of success, because it meant that the people that we put it there for, accepted it to a certain extent, so they didn't destroy it. That's not going to work right now, but it was a way to understand what was successful or not. So interesting.
But that actually is a good metric. Like, I always bike on the way to school through Fort Greene, and there's just like a mural to a kid that was killed, I'm assuming, in that corner, and it's been there for years, and no one's touched it. And then just recently, someone threw like some red paint on it, and it hurt, right? And you know what I thought? I was like, that wasn't someone from around here.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's been here for years and no one's touched it, or it's someone who doesn't know who this person is. But again, that's the problem with monuments, right? They're supposed to be forever. So how do you get the respect of people forever?
So I always want to talk about monuments, as you know.
Me too.
and so that has been a conversation in the past few years. I mean, it's always been a conversation, but it's been heightened in the past couple of years, given what started in Charlottesville, and now every city is really reassessing their collection and trying to balance out, representation through commissioning new monuments and whatnot. First, I just want to ask a general question. What are your thoughts on all that?
That's a super interesting question. A lot of people have asked me, like, what do you think they should do with those, Confederate general sculptures? And everyone's asking themselves that, right? Because you could destroy them. That seems wrong. You keep them there and recontextualize them. That seems like, yeah, I don't know, And not to evade your question, but when I saw the Confederate flag inside Congress, right, I was like, this is how Black people feel in Richmond when they see Stonewall Jackson on the avenue, right? It's like, boom, like that. This is just wrong. Why is this symbol here, right? And so I'm sympathetic to the idea of like, just melt the thing, But then when I try to think about that, I'm like, well, what has already happened, right? So like I was thinking, what happened in Bristol in the UK is really interesting, right? They took the statue of the slaver and they threw it in the bay. And I'm like, that's a great artwork because it's still here underwater and everybody knows it. So it's like present, not present. So like the history hasn't been erased. Now it's just a story that the statue of the, of the city forefather who was also a slaver is now here. See, it's down there. You can't see it, but it's down there underwater. And I was like, that's a really creative, very artistic way of dealing with the problem. It's like, it's not erasing it, it's transforming it, right? In a way that creates conversation, I can imagine people be like, well, should we fish it out? Like, oh, it's bronze, so it's fine, right? Nothing's going to happen to it underwater. And these are really art-like formal solutions, right? It's like, well, should we bury it so we know it's like, and then we put something on top, should we melt it and make a bunch of figurines that are then distributed? I don't know, But I think,
But for you personally,
yes,
as who you are, as an artist who sort of is in that realm personally, and again, you don't have to answer that if you don't want to, but I'm just curious, what are your thoughts? You know, there's a lot of the wheeze in what you're saying, but what is your thoughts?
my thoughts. I think deleting them is a mistake.
Okay.
Right? Because it happened. Two things happened. The Confederacy happened, right? We should not forget that. And we should not forget that people held on to it. So decades after it happened, these monuments were erected. So that also has to be remembered. They should not stay in the main spaces, you know? I don't know. I mean, I do think about it, you know? I feel like I often think about like these traditions that happened like after a war, they melted the cannons to make a monument to peace. And I always think like maybe they need to be transformed in this healing transformation. I know that sounds corny, but you know, that it's like literally like now it looks different, but you know, it was made from the metal of this other thing. So it's not a complete erasure. Because
I kind of like that idea, actually. Yeah. Kind of like that idea.
I felt like that
No,
was
I'm just saying. I've heard many ideas. I kind of like that one, which brings up another thing. So, do you think not just monuments but public art should have a lifespan? You know, an individual work should it have a lifespan? Because there's all this push for, you know, what we call permanence. You know, something should be there forever, and there's like some certain very important things in our culture. You know, Statue of Liberty has been there for how many years, and some of the other ones have been there for how many years, and it becomes a symbol, and sometimes the symbols change and the meanings change. So what are your thoughts on, you know, a lifespan of not just a monument, but a work of public art? And
I think they definitely should have a lifespan. You know, they say like there's the 3 deaths, right? It's like there's like when you stop breathing and your heart stops, then you're dead. Then they put your body in the ground and that you basically die again. And then when the last person who remembers you died, then that's the last death. And I feel like we have monuments that at some point stop performing a civic function. And we should treat them like a collection. The same way that a museum doesn't show everything they have in the collection. The museum sees itself that the collection in part is a record of civilization. And so it's important to keep it, but not necessarily to be shown. And I think cities should treat their public art as a collection, right? So it's like there's hangings. I mean, at a much slower speed, but it's like it's important for this to go to the archive, you know, and now we put something that's more relevant. But again, it's scarcity, right? I think the call for permanence is that it only comes up when it's tax levied money, right?
Yeah.
Right. It's like, oh, the citizens paid for this, the government is buying it. Therefore, we're not going to keep spending money on this, right? Like one technical issue I always have with public art is like they give you crazy amounts of money to make the public art, but there's no budget for maintenance.
Oh, don't get me started on that one.
Right. So you can only make something that is an impossible. People buy expensive cars and they take them to get the oil changed all the time. But God forbid an artwork needs some kind of maintenance. Oh, and it needs to be outside.
Yeah. But I mean, that's the flaw of the funding, because it's literally there are rules and laws attached to that funding and how it could be spent and what, you know, needs to happen and blah, blah, blah. So that's interesting. But
you know, I spent like a month in Laos in the city of Luang Prabang that has all these Buddhist temples, and then something that I thought was super interesting happened was like there's these wooden Buddhas and they're thousands of years old, but it's like a super tropical climate with the monsoon season. Of course, the polychromatic wooden Buddha doesn't last. They're always remaking them. It's like, no, but it's the same one because we just keep repairing it and eventually remake it, but it's been here for forever. You know? So I'm like, I like that kind of permanence.
So I just sort of keep on to that thread a little bit. I notice that a lot of your work is ephemeral or temporary, if you want to call it that, versus a permanent thing that's up for 30 years or whatever. Is that is that on purpose, or is how would you deal with a situation for permanence, if, when I put that in quotes, if you're asked to, is the thinking different in a temporary versus the permanent Paul Ramirez Jonas piece?
I actually have 2% for the art projects that are permanent in the
I'm aware.
country.
I'm aware.
And they both try to subvert the idea of permanence. It's funny because I have two objections to permanence. One is practical. It's like the minute you tell an artist that the work has to be permanent, you're basically telling them you can use like 3 materials. And so that's not great. And also I feel like there's a kind of violence because you and I are not permanent, right? So it's like, what does it mean to make something that's so against our nature? You know, the way we make things permanent are through transmission, right? Not, which allows for change. We don't make, right? Like that's the beauty of human beings, is like that I know things from my grandmother that she learned from her. It's not by sticking something in the river and like hoping that the river doesn't rip it to pieces, you know? And I know that sounds idealistic again, but I feel like there's a kind of, I prefer materials that are a little bit like our bodies, right? It's also a losing battle. Come on.
So you have all these kind of ideas, but then a commissioning agency is like, wait a minute, you have to, this has to last 30 years and has to be made out of material that could stand such and such and such and this and whatnot. And we don't have to maintain it. You know,
right.
So what happens there, you know?
Well, then,
and when you described how you were doing the public trust project, it sort of took that time to evolve into what it is, and sometimes you don't have that time, or you're not given that time.
Yeah,
a permanent work within these circumstances. So I'm just curious as to, you know, an artist who I think everybody's looking at your work, because now again, public engagement is so important in any kind of public artwork, whether it be temporary or permanent. And so, you know, somebody comes up to you and say, "Hey, Paul, we want you to do this project."
It's funny because I feel like it's like a trap, right?
It's a trap.
It's a trap because you want to be the artist who solves the problem, and so there's like a professional challenge, and also the funny thing about permanence that you and I, it seems daunting until you read those contracts, and it's like, oh, it's 30 years, and you're like, well, 30 years is nothing, right? Permanence in a more philosophical kind of imaginary way is interesting. 30 years is actually a little bit easier to solve. But there is a different kind of thinking, I think. Like I think the 2 projects I've done have tried to tackle that. You know, one is that little enclosed park that's only open to the public as long as people keep distributing the key. So that it's permanent, okay, right? And then the one I'll never speak of in New York City, because that was where I really cut my teeth in making public art in these settings. And that was a work that suffered from, so like the architects and the Army Corps of Engineers had a say, and 2 community boards had a say, and the Parks Department had a say, and so many people had a say that the project just became very neutral. And so I learned a lot from that project, what not to do.
And so it sounds like in those processes, you try to recontextualize, or sort of give new definition to both permanence and then public art in general as well. So
right, yeah.
So
I mean, I can speak about that project. It's on the Hudson River, and basically claims that we'll keep track of time until the Earth ends.
Mm-hmm.
So of course, everybody was like, well, that's impossible, right? And so it just played with that, the hubris of humans, that we're going to make this thing that will be here till the end of time. Of course, we can't do that.
So I want to ask you more questions, but I also see people are beginning to ask questions in the chat there. So there's a question, who is more important in the making of the work, you or the public?
Both. I always think that there's Godard, the French director, says it takes two to make an image, right? It's like it's like, what is speech without a receiver? It's communication. So I think both are important. The public without a text or a text without a public doesn't work.
But even in that situation, there is one of you, but in the public, there may be quite a few different opinions, voices, thoughts, ideas. How does that work if it's equal?
That is the tricky thing. That's the tricky thing about public trust that makes it tricky, or the lying piece, or all these pieces I've been making lately, because they insist on being one-on-one, one at a time, all the time, right? And the challenge of that is that I've been in situations where a museum will do the math and they'll be like, oh, but that just means that only 400 people are going to participate, right? But then my response yeah, but they'll participate for 10 minutes versus like the average viewership for an art object in a museum is, I think, under 30 seconds. So it'll be quantitatively better, no, qualitatively better, but quantitatively less. So I think I guess what I'm trying to say is like, it has to be a public artwork, but then addresses each person individually. So it goes from public to intimate, and then it has to become public again. That's why I always think there's part of it that has to be big, like a big billboard, or the promises have to be displayed, but the participation is intimate. It's just one-on-one. It's just about you. And then it becomes one-on-one. There's only one of me and there's only one of them.
And I'm going to ask one last question, which I think has two parts. We talked a lot about the role of the artist and the difficulties of public art, or the challenges of public art. Let's say challenges. However, public art has been
no pain, no gain.
Everybody wants to do it. Everybody sees the power of it. If you were to give an artist who hasn't done much or is thinking about doing public art advice, what would that be? And part two of that question is, what advice, information would you give an administrator who is looking to work with an artist to do a public artwork? There you go.
Okay, for the artists, I would say that they need to purge themselves of some ways of working. You make something in your studio, and your studio essentially looks like a gallery. It's like usually a little white cube. And then when you finish it in the context of your studio, you have a pretty good idea how it's going to look in the gallery. And if it looks in the gallery, you have a pretty good idea how it's going to look in the museum, especially these days when the galleries look like museums. But so the studio is like a rehearsal space. It's a space that rehearses the exhibition space. The studio is not a space that rehearses public space. So I think the biggest mistake I see with younger artists is they go from this conception and then they finish the thing and then they show it in public, and I think your sketches have to be in public, and I learned this when I worked at the Exploratorium. Like at the Exploratorium, they make they're working on something and they're like, let's try it. And they go from the shop to the exhibition floor and they just put it in there and see what happens. And often it breaks like in 20 minutes, right? Mm-hmm. And then they're like, well, let's go and work again. And they just keep going, and you have to keep trying it in public, right? Exhibition space is a kind of space. Public space is a different kind of space. Public work has to be made in public. And that's very hard to do, right? But it really doesn't quite guarantee, but it makes the work way more robust. Mm-hmm. and for someone who works with public artists, it's like, well, I'm going to say something that's so unpolitical, you know.
No, go ahead. This is a safe space.
It's like, it's not. It's almost like it depends what you're offering, you know. But ideally, if I ran the public art thing, I would have like small projects so I can groom a generation of artists so they can make small mistakes that are not career ending. Because I think part of the problem of these commissions is like people go with basically no experience and they just crash.
Mm-hmm.
And there aren't a lot of possibilities for smaller things. So I feel like what would be great is to be like, you go to Socrates and go to the open call and realize how hard it is to dig a hole in the ground. Mm-hmm. And then after you've done that, you know, maybe there's like a public art fund has a junior league. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, it's a subset of art that actually benefits from a lot of experience. Mm-hmm. The other art actually is more open in that way. Like there can be a maverick 19-year-old, you know, that just kind of like takes over the place by storm. But public art is tricky. You have to develop all of these skills and then they all have to come together. Mm-hmm. So I would say I would develop programs that tier that experience. So you can set up artists to succeed, mm-hmm. you know. That would be my advice.
Well, that is some really rich advice. and I'm thinking that we are up on time. And before Sarah comes back, I just want to thank you, Paul. I always love talking to you.
I love talking to you. Someday we'll talk in person again.
Knock on wood, hopefully sooner than later. Because, you know, I think the last time I saw you was at one of these things in person, no?
Was it the new? We talked at the New Museum. Was that the last time?
Yeah. That seems like 100 years ago.
That was 100 years ago. Yes.
Yeah. So
stay well and stay safe, and thank you everyone for coming to our talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight for this conversation. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Kendal. And thank you for watching us at home. Citizenship Programs will return next Wednesday with Just Us, stories from the front lines of the criminal justice system, presented by Modus Theater. Thank you for tuning in and have a good night.